In today's video I will show you guys how to paint the second best loyalist Space Marine Legion, the White Scars. But if you don't like the Mongol biker gang in Warhammer, you should still watch this to learn how to paint a nice smooth shaded white on your minis.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURES. So if you want to see how I painted the white armor of the Space Marine Captain with jump pack, the red trim and the various ornaments plus the free-handed White Scar symbol on his shoulder pad and shields, then let's get painting. And painting a smooth white can be notoriously tricky since most white paints are somewhat difficult to work with and their coverage, especially over dark colors, can be questionable at best. You can mitigate this somewhat by either priming the mini white or light gray or by adding a white zenithal highlight and paint over that, but as you can see I decided to go with a black primer and build up the color from there.
There are two main reasons for this. If I prime everything white, I will have to create the shadows instead of the highlights, so I don't really gain much, just reverse the process. And if I do a zenithal, I will still have to correct and redo my shadows, and the highlights will also not be exactly where I want them to be.
So I decided to go from black and start building up the white with brighter and brighter colors instead, giving me a lot of control over where I leave the shadows and where I put the highlights. Okay, but how do I deal with the issue of painting white over black primer? Simple, I just don't paint white. As you can see, the first highlight color I'm using is dark blue gray, and I'm using it to cover all the armor panels fully with this. The reason why I'm using this color is because it covers the black really nicely and it will give me a cold but colorful shadow for my armor panels. The plan is to paint a cold white armor and contrast it with the warm red elements of the trim.
And you could of course just paint everything white if you have the right white color for it and you are good at applying base coats. But if you do that, the armor will be super flat without any shadows and highlights, and the model will look like a dollar store plastic figure in the end.
The dark blue gray covers much better than most whites, but I still make sure to use multiple layers and achieve full opaque coverage before I switch to the next color. Stepping up the brightness, the next color is pale blue, which is a desaturated bluish gray color. As you can see, these paints are not only not white, but they are also not just simply gray. You can use brighter and brighter gray colors and it will work, but it's better if there is a little color in the shadows, otherwise the end result will look boring.
You don't need to go with the bluish tone though, you can also have something like a reddish gray for example, if you want to go for a warmer looking armor, and combine it with some colder colors on the trim instead, for example some blues or purples.
But I'm digressing a little bit, so let's get back to the pale blue. With this color I need to make some decisions about where I put my highlights. With the previous color I simply covered the whole surface of the armor panels. With this one I need to establish where I want the armor to be lighter. And I decided to go with a simple approach and assumed that the light is coming directly from above, so basically from a zenithal angle. This means that the surfaces that are facing up will be brighter than the ones that are facing away from the light or even towards the ground. Keeping this in mind, I started to create a transition with this color from the shadow towards the light on all the armor panels. Once again, I applied multiple layers until the central part of the highlight was fully opaque. Then I thinned the same paint down to a glaze, so something like 10-20% paint and 80-90% water, removed most of the moisture from the brush on a paper towel and started to glaze from the dark blue-gray towards the pale blue, so from the darker color towards the lighter one. I did multiple passes with the glaze until the transition between the two colors became smooth and the dividing line between them mostly disappeared.
Now that I had two bluish-gray colors in the shadows, it was time to switch to a nice bright true gray, medium gray.
This is one of my favorite gray paints because it's super smooth and easy to work with both as a layer and as a glaze, so it is great to smooth over gradients. I use this to paint in all the edges on the armor and of course to brighten up the previous highlights even more by painting this inside the previous pale blue but without touching the dark blue gray. Essentially I did the same as with the previous color but on a smaller surface and inside the previous highlight, leaving some of the darker one visible. Then I repeated the glazing step with this color as well, but this time I was dragging the paint from the pale blue towards the medium blue highlight, and I tried to avoid touching the original dark blue-gray completely. As you can see, the mini already looks quite white, to the point where my camera can even struggle to find the right white balance.
Now it is time to paint with some actual white, or at least something close to it, and finish the armor.
I'll take off-white and repeat the previous process, but on a very small surface inside the medium gray highlights and only on the upward-facing edges of the armor. This is still not pure white, but it is still better to be careful and use it quite thin and apply multiple layers to avoid any chalkiness or creating a very big difference between the previous layer and this one. After the usual glazing step, the armor is mostly done, but I will come back with a final step once I finish all the red elements.
Alright, with the white mostly done, it's time to do something about the armor trim to complete the iconic White Scars white-red color scheme.
Since I painted the armor nice and cold, I wanted to make a contrasting warm red trim, so I went with some orangish reds and avoided anything that had white in it. First I painted in all the trim with burnt red and covered all the elements I wanted to be red fully. As usual, it is better to do multiple layers to get a completely opaque coverage. And obviously you should avoid hitting the white elements at this stage, which is of course easier said than done. You might think that it would be easier to paint the red first and then the white, but in my experience that would just lead you to paint white over the red parts, and then when you try to correct it with the red, you would make mistakes on the white elements anyway. So it's better to paint the larger surfaces first and then carefully paint the smaller elements.
For the first step, I mixed burnt red and deep red roughly 50-50 and used it for the first highlights.
You could simply go for the deep red here, but I wanted to create a more subtle transition without much glazing to avoid having to mess around on the red and accidentally hitting the whites. Also, the white armor has relatively low and subtle contrast, so I wanted to match that with the red elements as well. The idea about the light placement is the same as on the whites. I do all the edges with this color and create my biggest highlights on top of the various elements with some smaller highlights on the sides. You can see this on the left shoulder pad, for example. I am painting a large highlight on the top of the curve of the trim and two smaller ones on the sides, one in the front and one in the back. I add even more deep red into the burnt red and continue highlighting, but on an even smaller surface and only on the upper facing edges.
Next, I will switch to pure deep red and continue reducing the highlights even further.
Finally, I add a little bit of deep yellow into the deep red to create an orangish red color for my final highlights. Remember that I wanted to go for a warmer red. By adding a brighter orange color instead of a white, I can up the brightness a bit without making the red colder.
That is the red done, but before I move on to painting the freehands, there is one more thing I wanted to do on the white armor.
I like the transitions on the armor, but now that I see the red next to it, I want to make it lighter while also making it a bit smoother as well. And the trick is to use a nice transparent white ink as the final glaze. Thin down, this will barely stain the armor, but it will make it a tiny bit brighter and help with masking the transitions between the colors even more. I will use this just like the glazes before, dragging it from roughly the middle of my transitions to the highlights, so from pale blue towards the off-white.
There is one downside of using an ink for this. It will create a glossy finish on the armor, and you can probably see how it glints in the light on the camera footage later on.
That's not a big issue though, and I will fix it in the last step after I'm done with the freehands, and who knows, maybe some of you prefer it to the matte finish, and in that case you can simply keep it like this as well. Alright, as you can see, I painted in all the other things on the model off camera, like the cape, the eyes, leather bits and the various metals. If you're curious about how I did it or what colors I used, let me know in the comments.
The model has all the right colors for a White Scar Space Marine, but it lacks all the iconography for now, and since I don't have any White Scar transfers, my only choice is to do some basic freehand.
I started with the red lightning bolt on the little shield on the front. There is nothing much to it, but looking up the shape on Google and then trying to copy the outline onto the model. I went with the burnt red again since it's a nice smooth paint and flows nicely from the brush. And it's always better to just do the outline first, since it will be obvious if you got the right shape or not, and if you mess it up, as you will see me doing on the shoulder pad, it's easier to correct it if there is not a lot of color to cover. Once I was reasonably happy with the shape, I filled in the color within the lines and used some of the same paints I still had on the wet palette from painting the armor to correct the lines and neaten it up. It is important to more or less match the color of the highlight with the color that you use to correct the outlines. So in the middle of the highlight I used off-white, and in the shadows medium gray or even pale blue. Finally I painted some brighter reds in the middle to match the white highlight of the shield and make the freehand look like it's part of the same object. It's not perfect, but it gets the job done.
After this I felt quite confident that I can do the same on the shoulder pad as well, but of course I was wrong.
The shoulder pad is curved, so it's a bit trickier to judge the proportions, so I managed to put the symbol too low and not leaving enough space to have the bottom part. Oh well, it's what it is. I used some medium gray to cover it and started again. The cover-up didn't need to be perfect since the new one would mostly cover it anyway, and everything else I can neaten up later. I managed to get the shape mostly done on the second try and then filled in the colors and cleaned up the lines with some grays, just like on the first one. Then I made the outline of the yellow box of the White Scars logo. This one is a bit tricky when it comes to the placement though. I needed to make sure that the lines of the box don't cover any of the protruding corners of the lightning, because if they do, the lightning will lose its shape. So I took care to place those lines either above or below those protruding edges. I filled it in with some yellow, which is quite easy since the underlying color is close to white, some more tidying up, and it was good to go. It won't win any awards, but now he actually looks like a proper White Scar. Now I just needed to apply some matte varnish to the armor panels to knock back the shine that the ink caused, and the final result looks like this.
That's it for today. I hope you guys found it useful, and if you did, consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know which legions or chapters you would like me to paint next. And we are getting really close to 10,000 subscribers, and it would mean a lot to me if we reached it in the next month or so. So if you haven't subscribed yet and you enjoy the channel, it's the perfect time to smash that subscribe button. See you guys in the next one.